I just want to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's event. I'm Emily. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's. So before we begin, I just want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events on our website at powells.com. We're looking forward to welcoming Zephyr Teachout and E.J. Dion Jr. tomorrow, and Lawrence Roberts on September 24th, among many others. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As well, if you haven't already done so, you can sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. So tonight, we're especially honored to welcome Kerri Arsenault in conversation with Megan Labrise. Kerri serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle, as she's a book reviewer at Oran Magazine and is a contributing editor at LitHub. Megan is the editor-at-large of Kirkus Reviews. She hosts Kirkus Weekly podcast, Fully Booked, and interviews writers of all genres. So in Kerri's new book, Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, she recounts the unbuilding of the small rural working-class town of Mexico, Maine, where she grew up. She excavates the past and the present, sifting through the historical archives and scientific records. And there's the book, yes, talking to the family and neighbors to present a portrait of a community that illuminates not only the ruin of the town and the collapse of the working class, but also the hazards of both living in and leaving home and the silences we are all afraid to violate. So this event also includes a Q&A. There's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. If there's a question you would like to ask, please type it into the Q&A box. If you don't see the Q&A box, try clicking that more. It sometimes hides there. I'll be sharing the link to the book multiple times this evening, and please do consider purchasing a copy to support Kerri and Powell's. Now please welcome Kerri and Megan.
Hi, Megan.
Hey, Kerri. Where are you joining us from tonight?
Roxbury, Connecticut, about an hour and a half outside of New York City.
And of course, I am, as always, in scenic, anarchist jurisdiction, Portland, Oregon.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Portland, for showing up. I see our participants' numbers continue to climb, and I will try not to be transfixed by that climbing number. Okay, we're here to discuss Kerri's book, A Long Time in the Making. I'm so proud of you, my friend. Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains. I mean, this is a book that asks, what are we willing to tolerate, and whose lives are we willing to sacrifice for life itself? That's a quote. It literally asks that question, which is making my job really easy. So I wanted to ask you if you would just start out our evening together by reading us a little bit from the book, just to whet the appetite.
Yes, I will get everybody in the scene in a bit. I won't read long. This is from the preamble. Mexico, Maine is a small paper mill town that lies in a valley, or river valley, as we now call the area, because I suppose you can't have one without the other. The hills are low and worn and carved by the water surrounding them, and trees line the rivers, which confine the town. Coursing through the valley's midsection, the Androscoggin River. Just across the Essouk and the river, in the neighboring town of Rumford, the mill's smokestacks poke holes in the white plumes they create. That's money coming out of those smokestacks, our fathers used to say, about the rotten smelling upriver drafts that surfaced when the weather shifted. That smell loitered amid softball games we played beneath those stacks and lingered on our father's shirt sleeves when they came home from work, allowing us to forgive the rank odor for what it provided. Where stack meets sky, the wide, slow-moving Androscoggin pivots and bleeds south and east, under bridges and over rapids, pushing through dams, slinking around islands and along inlets, skidding through other mill towns, picking up flotsam and jetsam, or passengers in canoes. In the calmer sections, its velvety waters press on with the slow caress of lava and despair. Rapid pools form when the water has nowhere else to go, sheltering the river's secrets in dark lagoons, where they congregate in the muck and fester like complicity. Sometimes the river pauses or eddies when it meets an obstacle and diverts into other routes, into unpredictable detours, following the edges of its design, yet it proceeds nonetheless. Rivers are like living bodies that need oxygen, breathe life, turn sick, can be wrecked by neglect, like human bodies, which we often think of as separate, not belonging to the landscape that bore them out. They tell a story, these bodies. They are the story. In deep grottos of the past, the great polar ice cap melted into glaciers and its calving mass crawled north, carving long, deep ruts that became the lakes and rivers of Maine. Our geologic past foretold everything about our future. But in this future, lives are unlived, secrets never revealed, and stories remain unwritten about how much we all lose. In this future, I learn of asphalt lakes, people bulleted with disease, burning tires scarring the sky, the forsaken, buried, and unmarked graves, the evisceration and erasure of home. In this future, we pardon legislators who convince us nature will sort itself out. In this future, we will have forgotten everything that came before, and our only legacy for those who will supersede us is the promise of ruin. It started early, this ruining of bodies and the yawning of leaders who didn't care about a landscape so altered by us, it's reciprocating abuse. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, wind it up.
I'm almost done.
Yeah.
When I walk along the Androscoggin and over its bridges, I try to see the river as it was or could have been. Even in its current spoiled state, it's still a thing of great agency. The transactions of its waters an awesome sight, wearing down granite and earth with the repeated force of its movement. Down at the rocky outcrops, when my father was a boy, a park with a bandstand and grassy plateaus wrapped the town with music and tranquility. There you can imagine the thunderous negotiation of the river's turbulent waters as they passed, defeating the submissive notes of flutes and clarinets. Before my father, my grandfather walked in the same park where shrubs and flowers and little stones drew a path amid the shade of chestnuts that were about to die. Before him, Abenaki crouched along the Androscoggin's edge to catch salmon lofting on its tide. Salmon had long flung their way upstream from the Atlantic to spawn, swimming past floodplains and alewives that gathered in the river's current. Gristmills and pollution and dams and the lawmakers discouraged their run-ups, but the hopeful salmon pressed on until they disappeared, except for the few each year who still hurl themselves up and over that first dam, wondering if by tenacity they will prevail. Their fate, it remains unknown. Poor salmon.
Poor salmon.
You know, Atlantic salmon I just realized this. Atlantic salmon, they're endangered, but they're only, the only wild ones are still in a few rivers in Maine.
Really?
Not that river, obviously.
This is particularly interesting because you're playing to a salmon crowd right now.
Right.
Not the same salmon, of course,
right.
but you know, of particular interest also to a crowd where, you know, we have a river bisecting our city and we have a border of another river up top. I found out, inspired by reading your book and doing a little Googling about my own home environment, that there's actually a Superfund site where the Columbia meets the Willamette.
I think I knew that too. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
You can, and for anybody who's interested, you can go to the EPA website and just click in Superfund sites. You can find out where they are in your communities, or brownfields, which are kind of like a low-grade Superfund site.
For anybody who doesn't know what a Superfund site is, do you want to give a little ditty? I
would say, well, I'm going to just give you Kerri's definition, not the official definition. I could Google it, but it's basically the EPA set up this fund where the businesses that created the pollution had to put in cash into this fund to clean up their own messes. It was sort of a big kitty, right? Superfund. In the past decade or so, though, that the monies have been slow to go in there, and it's sort of being gutted a little bit, this Superfund. And what they do is the EPA puts like a list of like the most egregious sites that need cleaning up. They sort of do them by priority, and places like my river or maybe your river, maybe not so high on the priority list. They do things that are really egregious. Like I think the Hudson maybe is one, I'm not sure, but yeah.
My old river.
Yeah, your old river. We all live near dirty rivers. and if you don't, the rivers always go into a larger body of water.
What dirtied your river?
So This is a small paper mill town, I should say, where 3 generations of my family worked, and the paper mill opened in 1901. First paper was made there. And up until 1997, paper was bleached using elemental chlorine. And in that process, in that combustion process, it creates a very dangerous byproduct called dioxin. And it's one of the most carcinogenic and dangerous toxics known to humankind. Like the tiniest amount is dangerous because it's bioaccumulative and it's persistent chemical too. It stays in the system and it accumulates the further up it goes into the food chain. At the top of the food chain are like humans, and even little babies are worse because they get breastfed. Anyway, it accumulates in the fat of living things, so like meat and fish and their byproducts and that kind of thing. So up until 1997, they used elemental chlorine to bleach paper, and then 1997, our mill switched. It was probably earlier for other mills, but it was regulated that they switched to using elemental chlorine-free bleaching. And it didn't mean it was chlorine-free. It just meant it was elemental chlorine-free.
Right.
So it created a lot less dioxin, but still dioxin. And that's one of the toxics. That's one of the most dangerous. There's also mercury, benzene, all kinds of other terrible things that have been dumped in the river for over a century.
Were you listing terrible things? Because I lost audio on you for 1 second.
Oh, I wasn't listing terrible things. I only said like mercury, benzene, and dioxin. Those are probably 3 of the more terrible ones. There's also things dumped in the air and then landfills. I don't have a list on me, but those 3 are pretty bad on themselves. And in fact, they only found out about this. I graduated from high school in 1985, and that's when the EPA did this study. They started finding fish downstream in our river that contained dioxins. They were just doing a fish study for something else. They found these dioxins, and they traced it back, and they found that our mill, in fact, was one of the worst in the nation. They were doing all these fish studies that created this dioxin. So I had basically grown up with that my whole life, with that in the river, in the air, in the land.
Our mill became kind of an alternate title for me after reading Ben Fountain's blurb on the cover, and Our Town for the 21st Century. And he goes on with, may I, updated and expanded to account for ecological horror. What kind of life have we made for ourselves when the very thing that sustains us also kills us? Whoa.
Yeah, and when he says, I should say when he says sustains us too, it's like, I mean, first of all, I'm making paper. Both of us are in publishing, but it's not that the paper sustains us. It's that the jobs in my town sustained us for generations. This was my father, my grandfather, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, everybody for 2 generations, 3 generations, both sides of the family, and practically everybody in town. And they were good jobs, and these were working class jobs with people who didn't have a higher education. I was one of the first to go to college, and my sister went, and then I went in our family ever. So these jobs were, healthcare, pensions, good pay, solid. My father put 4 kids through college on 1 income, basically. Well, plus student loans, but they managed. They did pretty well. Yeah. Middle class lives. So.
And what was your father's specific job at the mill?
So my father was a pipe fitter for 45 years, meaning, I don't know if anybody here knows about a paper mill, but it goes 24/7. It doesn't shut down. So somebody asked me in one talk, they were like, what can a pipe fitter do? How many pipes are breaking? Well, it's not necessarily, he has to be there because a pipe can't break and you can't just stop the mill. Everything keeps going. It's like being on a ship. If a part breaks, you go down to the machine shop and somebody makes it. And so, yeah. And it was funny, I went on a tour of the mill just a few years ago. I'd never been. And I was there for maybe a couple hours. And I can't even imagine being there for 45 years. It was so loud and hot and miserable. Just felt, not miserable, but it was just loud and hot. It was a lot of input,
What did it smell like?
It smells like farts. I mean, basically, the mill is, when you drive into our town, it is a sulfurous, acrid thing. But it also, like, you know, my father, like I say in the beginning, that smell was also in my father's shirt sleeves when he came home from work. So I actually associate that smell with like home and family and like love, which is terrible. But it's like, it's part of the whole conundrum of this book, right? You know, the thing that smells terrible is also the thing that makes you think of love. How could that even be, you know?
This is a quite paradoxical work.
Yeah, I would say.
And there's a lot in it. There's this passage. I wonder if I can flip to it really fast. It's buried in paper. And
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to read just that first paragraph?
Can you point me to a page?
I have a galley, so it's 284.
It's probably close. There's some bad sentences in the galley. I'm sorry, I'll get you a new copy. Yes, I have it. It starts buried in paper.
Yeah.
Where would you want me to start at the top? No.
That first paragraph I'm interested in.
To understand the past, that one.
Really, to give everybody in our audience a sense of how complicated this book is and how many topics you cover.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just preface this by saying somebody pointed this out the other day, Meredith Hall. She said, oh, you researched your family tree. You went to Prince Edward Island, you went to France, and then you researched the history of your town, and then the history of the mill, and then the history of the EPA, and then the history of all these chemicals, and then you talked to scientists, epidemiologists, and doctors, and then I was like, no wonder I was crazy. Okay, so it was a lot of work, 10 years. So to understand the past and the future, it foretells in my family in disease rates, in our governmental and societal rules. For 10 years, I gathered information from historical societies, academic journals, the EPA, experts, legal briefs, sociological studies, poets, environmental historians, lobbyists, courts, lawyers, news articles, chemists, death certificates, and took thousands of photographs. I sent out surveys, talked to high school classmates, teachers, mill workers, students, lunch ladies, my mother, my father, their friends. I traveled to Canada, France, and to 15 or so other countries along the way, and made endless trips to Maine. I read about organochlorines, Acadian history, labor unions, logging, economics, chestnut trees, Agent Orange, and long, boring essays about how boilers work.
Womp womp.
Womp womp. Yeah, there's no end, and there's no end to what I don't know, can't translate, won't ever have the time or capacity to understand, because I'm not an expert of any kind, except for following rabbit holes that tunnel far below what the naked eye can see. Yeah, it was a lot.
I feel like there's some expertise displayed in this book. I mean, there's gotta be.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I learned a lot. I think this book is, you watch me do the research in the book. It takes place in present tense from 2009 to 2019. And it's really me figuring out what I'm trying to do at the same time doing it. Like I started this book with just the death certificate of my grandfather and his obituary that I found had some incorrect information, come to find out, like where he was born. And so I thought, what else could be wrong in the artifacts of history? And I went down this path of genealogical study, but it led me down this path of environmental pollution and all the other tributaries of this dirty river.
I like what you just did. I'm picking up what you're laying down. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it sounds corny, but the structure of the book really is kind of based like that. It was like I just had to keep going where the research took me, and sort of following the money at the same time to try to figure out where things met and what was going on and how to structure that. At the same time, going down river and through these tributaries, and like this little poor salmon, I was going uphill at the same time. But I was also going really back and forth to home. I mean, the plot really is me going back and forth to Maine. It's just a recursive movement going back and forth and back and forth. And really what that did was showed me that the reason I didn't really see this when I was living there, I was just too close to it. And I could see it from afar, but when you're far away too, you can't see things a certain way either. You're not close enough, you know? So it was that movement just sort of made me sort of wrestle with the insider, being an insider and outsider to my hometown, also like being a critic and an advocate for my hometown, which I go back and forth in this book, and also a witness and a participant. You know, I think you see, this is not a journalistic expose. I mean, I actually get involved with a water rights group. I actually start a water activist group in my town while I'm writing the book. So I wasn't objective in any kind of way. So yeah, that back and forth really, I think they all enunciated each other, that tension, and to show that there are just a lot of gray zones here. You know, it's like that same goes back to that same question about what are we willing to sacrifice in order to give ourselves life? You know, there's just a lot of gray zones, a lot of questions rather than answers, I think, in my book. Would you say?
And I would, and the answers can change, you know, they can change for people.
That's so true. Yeah. I mean, yes, I think even in the book I wrote something like, especially in genealogy, and that's where I started this book. In genealogy, what you go looking for, you never quite find, but you will always find something you're not looking for. It's like that exact thing, you know.
I do, and this might be the appropriate time for me to bring this up, because out of all of the things you enumerated in the second reading, Acadian history, like this was entirely new to me.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like nothing of it, huh?
Tell me of your people.
So my people, is anybody here? No, raise your hand.
You can always chat. You can send something to the chat if you
Anybody
are of Acadian descent.
I was surprised at how many people did not know. So, including me. So, I did not know. I'll try to make it short because it's a very long history. But basically, both sides of my family come from Acadia, which is what was the Maritime provinces in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and parts of Maine were known as Acadia. It doesn't exist anymore, but the people still do, Acadians. So what happened this is going to be really short, but in 1755, the Grand Derangement, which was the great expulsion of Acadian people from their homeland, it was the literal translation is the big bother or the big disturbance, which is kind of an understatement. It was really a ethnic cleansing of Acadian people in 1755 to around 1764. The British, they refused to sign an oath to the British king and be loyal to them. So it was a lot of fighting back and forth between France and England at that time. So anyway, they were like, you won't sign the oath, you're out of here. So they put them all in ships, separated their families, burned their homes, sent them hither and yon up and down the coast of New England and the United States, and sent a bunch of them to France too. And the people that were in France actually left later on and came and settled in Louisiana, which became the Cajuns. The word Cajun is kind of a perversion of Acadia, kind of through a couple of generations of the word. But yeah, in my family, actually, or some of my family, the Arsenaults at least, they hid in the woods in Prince Edward Island. They were like hiding until all the ships were gone, and then they reestablished themselves there. And those ancestors were the ones that came down from there in the late 1800s and 1900s to work in the textile mills in New England, textile and paper manufacturing mills in New England. And it's an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people know, is that the Acadians and the Franco-Americans, which I'm separating the two, Acadian being from maritime provinces, Franco-American could be from like Quebec, or it's French, other French-speaking parts of Canada, Montreal, and Quebec, they were really the backbone of the industry in New England, the Industrial Revolution. And it was just surprising to me that, like I said, I didn't know any of this. Most of my town is made of these people, and we didn't know any of this growing up or have anything studied in high school. Or, you know, we really were unaware. All I knew were my family stories, you know. And I just found it, I don't know, I mean, I really believe that we're built on the foundation of our ancestors in a lot of ways, whether it's directly or the historical reach of them, you know. And when I say that, I mean, like, I knew my great grandmother, and she knew her great grandmother. So my historical reach goes back almost 200 years, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So anyway, I'm kind of rambling on, but point is, that's where the Acadians, and they came from, I did go back to France too, and they came from basically the Loire Valley, River Valley. They were watermen there. They were watermen in Acadia. They came to Acadia and literally pushed back the tide with their hands. They built these little abuteaux, these little systems, these little devices that would let the salt water, you know, make the salt water go out and keep the fresh. Anyway, it was, and then they moved down to Maine, and still watermen dealing, you know, living on the river and creating paper from hydroelectric power. It's really interesting.
It's super interesting. They seem super neat and industrious, and yet there are some really familiar, ugly stereotypes about them when they first come into Maine. You know, that they're dark-skinned people who basically need to be set to a task. You know, not governance. You know, as a Sicilian American, you know, like it's the same exact thing. You know, like it.
Yeah.
Almost as if, you know, they're beast people as considered.
Yeah, they treated them real. Yeah, I mean, the KKK was huge in Maine. It was like 50,000 KKK, and their agenda was basically anti-French Catholic.
Yeah,
I mean, which was basically my ancestors, my people. I mean, my grandmother was born in 1918, so yeah, they really considered them subservient.
Yeah.
You know, dark skin, like you said, that they defiled American culture. You know, they spoke in pagan tongues like Latin masses, you know, French, of course. And these sentiments sprang partly because they believed that loyalty to the Pope precluded loyalty to America, you know. And if you couldn't be, you know, if your views question American anything, then, you know, you need to go. I mean, sounds familiar today.
Yikes,
even.
that's getting a little too timely.
Like,
yeah.
There was I just found out the other day too, and I didn't know this, there was a eugenics program in Vermont in the 30s up until like 1957 that was against the First Nation people, the Abenaki that I spoke of in the prologue, and the French Canadians. Like, they lumped them together, like, nope, you shouldn't be here, we're gonna, you know, sterilize you. Yeah, it was pretty, you know, and they made speaking French illegal in schools in 1918, which is when my grandmother was born. So they even legislated the tongue. I mean, they were really treated pretty horribly. And there's still like really weird echoes of that. I feel even in, you know, maybe not as now. I think the town has, you know, people have moved away. There's been a very big exodus of everybody because the mill is kind of in a slower operational mode, but there's still like hangovers from that in Maine, I believe, and in literature for sure. We won't get into that yet though.
Well, let's get into literature a little bit though, because another one of the things you enumerated was poems. Whose poetry inspired this book?
Oh, you mean, are we talking about Longfellow?
You tell me.
Well, I don't know if Longfellow did not inspire this book. He inspired me to be mad, because he wrote that poem Evangeline, and you know, Longfellow had never been to Acadia, and he wrote this, you know, love poem about, you know, this couple separated by the expulsion, and he really romanticized sort of what it was about. It was some kind of, you know, fealty, women and relationship, but it was a real horror show. And he, you know, he wrote it from his sort of upper class milieu of, you know, New England, New England, who I should add, helped the British in, burning the houses down, the New England folks. So they were no friends of the French Canadians and the Acadians. And I just really feel like Longfellow co-opted that myth so much that Acadians even believe it to be theirs themselves. I think there's a big statue of Evangeline in New Orleans or something like that. And I've read it all over, everywhere you go. And it has really nothing to do with sort of anything except for Longfellow's sort of sentiment. Yeah, so that poem inspired me to be mad. As did Anne of Green Gables. Sorry, everybody. I know everybody loves Anne of Green Gables, but similarly, especially in that book, there's some racist language in that book about Acadians, and I don't have that at my fingertips right now, and I have a terrible memory, but I write about it in my book.
So these people came to Maine. They worked in the mill. They became you. Who started the mill, and what kind of man was he?
So Hugh Chisholm was actually, he was a poor, his father died when he was really young, and he had to like dig potatoes for a living or whatever. He was a self-made man, an industrialist, just like, I don't know who are the, he was an industrialist of a certain age. He pulled himself up by the bootstraps, and he started the mill by not just building the mill, but I should say he built the entire town. He built houses, he built banks, he built train stations, he built railroads, he did everything. Like the whole town was like he called it his magic town, actually, at one point. He did everything. So it was interesting because the town was so dependent upon him he even gave turkeys out at Christmas like he just built recreation facilities, and people became so dependent on him that I think even to this day, that dependency again is still left over, because he was the leader, quote, of the town, but he really didn't live in the town. He was an absentee manager. He lived in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue for the most part, in a farm somewhere in New York. I can't remember what the name of the farm, where he raised, thoroughbred cattle or something. He was compared to, it's hard to say. I don't want to paint him as a bad guy, because I think compared to some, conglomerates or corporations, he probably did pretty well by the people in this town. But I think the damage done was really the dependency upon sort of the outside leadership, or dependency on like whatever the mill could provide for this town. Because the leadership there sometimes, well, over the years, in the past, 20 years, has really faltered. And the Chisholm is still lauded to this day in that town. The new leaders have not emerged.
We have a few questions
loading going on. Oh,
and we're going to get to them in about 5 minutes. I have just a few more questions for you. Hugh Chisholm called it his magic town. What did the kids at the other high schools call the area you lived in?
The Cancer Valley. Yeah, I guess we really haven't talked about that. So because of this dioxin, because of all the pollution, because of the century-long pollutants in our environment, our cancer rate was so high that people started calling it Cancer Valley. And then a Boston TV station came in and did some news program about trying to get to the bottom of the high cancer rates, which I also tried to get to the bottom of, which is like, it's like counting stars. I don't know what to compare it to, but it's like that. It's literally impossible to connect environmental pollution to disease. It's very, very hard, because how do you know something coming out of this smokestack is causing this over here? You know what I mean? But at the same time, again, if you just step back away from it, the writing is on the wall. You just look, and there are people in our town. Our town was 2,000 people, and the corresponding town, Rumford, we're kind of like twin towns. The mill was in Rumford. I lived in Mexico. They had 5,000 people or something, maybe 7,000. But the cancer rates were astronomical. At one point, the Dana-Farber Cancer Center called our hospital, our hometown hospital, and called the doctor and was like, what the hell is going on here? There were something like 28 children out of the 32 children there were all from our town, in the 80s with cancer. I mean, and there were all kinds of, aplastic anemia, which is really rare. We had, I don't know, there were like 40 cases. I mean, I can't remember what the numbers are, but really rare. So Cancer Valley, yeah. And I tried to get to the bottom of it, but it's a tricky thing to do. But I think, I don't know. I mean, in the middle of this book too, as you know, like my father dies in the middle of me writing this book. He gets cancer and dies, as do I think about 6 or 7 people in the book as I'm writing it that worked in the mill or lived near the mill. So there is other evidence, I should say, like human evidence, like faces and names and people and generations of families and generations of homes. People were just dying by the handfuls and getting sick or getting sick.
What are some of the questions you wanted to ask that you didn't get a chance to?
I wanted to ask?
Yeah.
I wished I would have asked my father more about his work in the mill. Like that's something it was just around. It was just part of the sort of white noise of our lives. And, he just went to the mill every day, 45 years, as did his father, as did his grandfather. And I never even really talked to him about it. Like, what was that like? And so when I stepped foot inside that mill, I was just kind of blown away that he did that. He did that for us for 45 years. I mean, it was probably, when I went in, it was probably like way better than when he started. He was, and his father worked in the bleach room, so he got really sick. My grandfather also died of cancer. He worked in the bleach room and when the bleach was really bad and the chemicals were, so yeah, I wish I would have asked my father more questions, really, if anything. I really tried to, some people complained that I didn't, I say some people from our town, they're like, you didn't talk to the mill. But, the mill has been telling their story for years and years and decades. And I really wanted to look behind what they were saying. I knew what they were going to say and they're still saying it, but I wanted to see what was behind all that.
Thank you. And I can't do better on a question than that for you. And I see we have a lot in the queue. So I'm just going to click over.
Yeah, let's go. Hi, Tom Beer.
Okay. Tom Beer asks, what is the status of the river now? Is it still polluted or is it being cleaned up?
So with chemicals like dioxin and mercury, the status is a Class C river, and it's the lowest grade in the state. It's just above industrial. It still has like 20-something dams on it, so the fish will never get up there. And as far as being cleaned up, it's probably impossible with the stuff that's embedded into the soil and the sludge unless they dredged it all. I mean, they would just take things and just like open up a big thing and just, and the stuff would flow right into the, into the water for decades, up until like 1997. I was already gone from high school by then, and they did the same thing with the air. So there's, it hasn't been declared a Superfund site, but I found some stuff in the Maine Department of Environmental Protection that shows that it possibly is. But the thing with Superfund sites is that I think, no, I might get this wrong, but because it's still in operation, there's all kinds of grandfathered laws that sort of protect the business owner. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know. That sounds a little vague. I'll have to look into that, Tom, and get back to you. But it's not being cleaned up. I mean, it's been cleaned up by just because there's less dioxin going in the water and less chemicals by generally the EPA, establishing regulations. However, I have to say this, and this is important, they now burn tires for fuel for the cogeneration plant. And I did some research on that. And what I found out is that because they're burning the tires for their own power, they arguably, and some people have done research on this, they arguably are polluting more than they would, than they did before, like 1970, because there's so many loopholes in this using tires for fuel thing that they could be actually polluting a lot more. It's just not sooty or whatever. Yeah, so that's to be determined. I'm working on a separate project about that.
Thank you for the excellent question, Tom. And we have another excellent question that builds on that, really, from an anonymous attendee. Can you share a little bit about the state of the mill and town as it is today? I am particularly interested in whether or not the town has been able to find other sustainable work to sustain the community. I live in Minnesota, and mining and paper mills have been lost here and not really replaced. The migration has been to large cities in the Midwest, so we've lost a lot of our small town vibrancy.
Yeah, the mill is still in operation. It's, 600 people work there or something. What they found, this is kind of a sad chapter in the book and a sad chapter in the town, is that Nestle came and got a contract for 15 years, renewable contract to obtain the water rights to the municipal water supply. So the town sort of, it's like the new mill, it's the new hugeism in town, like I said, that's where I feel like they've depended on sort of outside interest for so long, instead of really like stepping back and taking a look and seeing what the resources are there, which is like a lot, like probably like loyal, hardworking workforce, loving families, really solid people, also beautiful natural environment. I mean, if you just like took the mill out of the picture, it's gorgeous there, rivers and mountains and skiing and everything. So they have not, they deferred to Nestle, unfortunately, and that happened while I was writing the book. But I'm going to tell you this, I just finished a grant project too about reporting on this town with another person from my hometown. There's a report coming out via the New York, the Architect League of New York. That's going to be coming out probably in the next week or so. And I have some suggestions for them, but I can't go through it now. It would take too long, but that should be coming out soon, and that will be posted on my website.
Next question is really more of a comment, but it's a beautiful one. It's from Ishrat Syed. Seize them and whirl them aloft and sprinkle them far o'er the ocean, Longfellow says in Evangeline. How shameful that even today in the 21st century, the exclusionary and othering trope survives unscathed in human interactions.
Yeah, and that's beautiful, thank you. What's terrible too is I got married in Longfellow's church, and Hugh Chisholm went to that same church, so we were like in this really weird trifecta. Yeah. I got married in his church before I knew any of this.
I have another question here. As you said, you had to conduct research in so many different subject areas to write this book. What was your favorite part of this book to research? And
none, no.
Which was your least favorite?
My least favorite,
either or both.
I actually really like, I think the sociological part, which we didn't really get into, was really my favorite, but about, and when I say sociological, is about how toxic living under toxic duress like this causes people to feel really uncertain. And we should talk about that as relation to Portland too, and the COVID. Living under toxic duress can really affect people, emotionally, sociologically, and they start to, after years and after a long time, it can come out in like PTSD or hypervigilancy or non-empirical belief systems. And I feel like I actually saw that in my town. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but like the pressures that were on people, people like to know what's around the corner. They don't like to live in such uncertainty, but with toxins or toxics, you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know if it's affecting you. Scientists say, you know, the scientists would be like, oh, it's not harming you. It's not harming you. And then the doctors would say it's harming you. And people were left really like confused and adrift. And as was I researching this. So I think that was my favorite part, because it really led me to understand sort of the mentality of the people there, and how living like that can really have long-term effects, and I think even led to, I think, political effects, actually, even, I should say. So the least favorite was about like how boilers work and stuff like that. Like I mean, I have to, yeah, I have no mind for that. It was terrible. Very terrible.
What's the difference between toxins and toxics?
Yeah, so toxins are naturally created. So when I say toxics, that's man-made or human-made. Toxins are natural. There's a whole thing on my website about it too.
Also Portland related, right now they are testing the waters of the Willamette to see if any of the tear gas has made it from the streets of downtown Portland into the river, which they say they have not found yet.
Well, not to scare everybody, but I have been doing some research on, I mean, these dioxins, you know, they also come from wildfires. So when buildings burn, are the biggest source, of course, because they have all kinds of PCBs and all kinds of things. And when those things burn, it creates dioxins. Second, trees. Third, brush. So, and it's not mitigated by anything. Like, at least in the mill, it's mitigated with smokestacks and processes. So wildfires can create a lot of dioxin. There, I said it. Sorry. But there's been very few studies about it. And I looked, and there was one in Missoula, one in Southern California, and one in Chile. And all the studies point to, yes, wildfires create dioxin. I guess it's been hard to sort of pin down, you know, it's like trying to catch wind, you know, trying to understand where the dioxin is. But that is what I've been worried about too with the wildfires, because the long-term effect of dioxins is basically tragic and terrible.
Let's get a little more hopeful. Do you have any other books or research projects planned for the near future?
Everything. Like, I mean, there's so much in here. Like I said, this thing about burning tires for fuel is interesting to me. I'm also exploring about monuments and resource extraction, and how we memorialize we memorialize people like Hugh Chisholm or Paul Bunyan, but we don't memorialize the consequences of their actions, of their work, of their crimes. Like, so I'm looking at how to sort of memorialize toxic sites and toxic injustice. It's kind of.
I had another question for you, dovetails nicely with this. It's from Marion Winnick. Thank you, Marion. Do you see yourself as a career narrative nonfiction writer? Will you write another kind of book?
This is a good question. I have been thinking about writing. I do love writing nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, but I have this novel idea. Well, I actually have a biography idea, and Marianne, you will understand this, because so many biographies are about famous people, and they're not necessarily interesting people. They're just famous. And I thought, why not write a biography about somebody that's kind of ordinary? Would that be interesting? I don't know. So then I thought, well, if I write it as a novel, it will be interesting, because then I can make it up. So I want to write a biography, but as a novel.
Whoa.
So, but I'll try. But narrative nonfiction is my main game. Is that Campari?
You know it. Anonymous attendee says, greetings from Boston. Greetings from Boston. Are you familiar with the book A Civil Action about pollution and water from a tannery in Woburn, Massachusetts?
Ish, yes. But you know, I never set out to do an expose, because I don't have a lot of money. I don't have the scaffolding of academia. I don't have, you know, I'm not a New Yorker staff writer. I mean, if I really wanted to do an expose and like find out exactly what's happening, I mean, first of all, really a lot of the access that I got from the people is because they know me and they know my mother and they know my family. If I went in there and was like, I don't know, it would certainly be a different book, not one I wanted to write. I mean, somebody else is welcome to write that. Maybe I'll write it too, I don't know, but I'm familiar with that-ish. I mean, there are mill towns like this all over the United States. There's little towns, big towns, you know, it doesn't matter if it's coal mines, if it's tanneries or cotton mills. I mean, there's so much happening here, the UK, Sweden, Germany, mill towns all over the place that are, you know, it's that Faustian bargain that's happening everywhere.
Here's a friendly name. I have a question from Meg Massalone.
Okay.
Have there been lawsuits or class action suits brought against the mill for their complicity in these cancers? If so, how has that divided the community?
None. No. There has been some, I mean, in the book, I go through some of the stuff that some people tried to do in the town, but it really, a lot of it ends with frustration because people run out of time, they run out of money, they run out of energy, they run out of faith that they're going to ever get any correct answers, you know? So no, there's never, the only class action suit that's pending right now is they've sued Nestle. There's a class action suit in Nestle, I think it's in Connecticut, I can't remember what states, but they just included Maine, our town, in this class action suit because Nestle is declaring that they're bottling spring water, Poland spring water, which is from Maine, from our town, this municipal water source, but they're claiming it's groundwater, which basically it is. So that's the only class action, but nothing about the cancers. No, but I should say that I just started this other project too. It's on my website and it's related to this grant that I did. It's called this Cancer Yearbook. And I've got people that are sending me photographs, headshots, like yearbook headshots of themselves. And I put their name and then their diagnosis under that. And what my intent is to create a critical mass so that you can't ignore it. Look at all these people and these generations of families that have been sick.
Okay, we have just a few more questions and just a few more minutes. So I'm gonna ask you to do the 1-2 shuffle.
I'll go really quickly through them. You want me to whip through them? Okay, the research for the book. Oh, sorry, you gonna go? You gonna ask them?
I have a question from Bailey Holmes. Did doing the research for this book change your perception of home? If so, how?
Yes, I came to actually like it.
You could go a little bit more.
I developed a very deep affection for everybody back home. I mean, it was a place, you know, it was a place I did not want to go back to over and over and over again. But I ended up really appreciating the people that live there a ton. Like really feel affectionate towards them. So yes, I mentioned I received pushback from the people in town and wanted you to talk to the mill directly. This type of criticism is typically why people are fearful. Were you ever afraid to write this book? Nah, I was never afraid to write the book.
This call is coming from inside the house. This is from.
Oh, this is inside the house. I was never afraid. I was never afraid to write the book. I had some real wonderful people behind me, push, you know, whether it's from my town or like writing advisors, or I just had such a support system that I never felt afraid. Marion, how do you feel about having your first book published during COVID? It sucks. But I have to say I've adapted and I really like these because I wouldn't be able to be with Megan one day here and in Wisconsin tomorrow and then Thursday night with John Freeman in Point Reyes. It just wouldn't be happening. So, you know, I think it's been really intimate in a different kind of way. I mean, I was really disappointed at first and I'm trying not to think about it. Otherwise it'd be a gaping like hole in my heart, but I've adapted.
You gonna lightning round the rest of these, or you want me to read?
Go ahead.
If you want to, though, I have a cocktail.
I want to finish. We only have 3 left, so we should get to them.
Yvette Jardine, with the easing of the Clean Water Act, what do you think is the future of mill towns like Mexico, Maine?
I wish I could say. I really just think, here's what I keep telling everybody, just vote. Vote for people like who choose life over death. And then we will have a future. Otherwise, there is no future. I mean, the paper industry in the US is dying, period. You can make paper faster, cheaper, better in South America than you can, it takes 50 years for a tree to grow, and it's high taxes, and it's isolated. It's a nightmare. So the paper making industry is dying.
We have a question from my beloved colleague, Laura Simeon. While the story of your town has echoes in stories from around the country and the world, what elements do you feel are tightly bound with this specific setting? What cultural or other elements did you feel you had to explicitly explain to readers who don't know the setting as intimately?
I feel like the Acadian history is one part, because it's really integral to the town, and it's integral to the working class in New England. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. So yeah, I think that's the real specific. But otherwise, working class, there's a lot of similarities. It's small town. Maine is a specific conundrum, I think, especially. I don't think there's any state that's as dramatically, like, it's perceived, its nickname is vacation land, and people go there, and it's beautiful, and it's, there's all this stuff. And I think Maine has a particular dissonance with the Maine I'm describing, between the one that Maine is perceived. I don't think there's a state quite as dramatic in that. So I think describing some of those Maine things in there is specific to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sidebar, or tributary, if you will. Should we be eating lobster, yes or no?
I do not eat lobster. I barely, yeah. I mean, any meat you eat is going to have dioxin in it, period. Our body burdens are like to here, basically, of dioxin. I mean, it's no surprise to me that they're saying, people that live in sacrifice zones, or people that live in poor areas, or are more susceptible to COVID. It doesn't surprise me, because these kind of chemicals, dioxin, mercury, can really suppress your immune system, and they can do, I mean, I have a list this long of things that these chemicals do to your bodies. So it's no surprise to me that those people are also having problems with COVID more. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We're 1 more minute, 1 more question. It's from Susan Guide. I'm interested in what similarities or differences you see between your book and Monica Woods' memoir, When We Were the Kennedys.
Okay, so Monica grew up, like, I could see her house from my house, but she was older than me. I think the biggest differences is that she doesn't really look at the environmental questions. Hers is a memoir about her father's death. My impetus wasn't my father's death. That just happened in the middle of the book. Her father probably died from, I think it was heart disease, but heart disease is, a lot of people in our town died of heart disease. And that's one of the things that can happen with this particular toxic too, is heart disease. But that's the biggest difference. Similarities, our fathers worked in the mill. There's a lot, like her opening pages, like, choked me up when I first read them. I actually reviewed that book when I had already started writing mine, and then hers came out, and I was like, are you kidding me? How many books about Mexico, Maine can there be? It's a town of 2,000, but I'm doing an event with her at the end of October. So I'm excited about that, to talk about those things. Yeah.
Okay, because you're done doing an event with me, Kerri Arsenault, author of Real Town, Reckoning with What Remains. Please buy this book. It's excellent. I would especially recommend it to fans of Susan Orlean's writing. There's a lot of richness in here. And for anybody who's interested, after this presentation, we'll be meeting at McMiniman's for a beer in about 12 to 18 months.
Yes, I'm going to be there.
You will.
Thank you, Megan, so much. Oh my God, it's so good to see you.
Thank you both so much. That was a great talk. That was amazing. And I wish we could all go down to McMiniman's, but someday for the future. Thank you everyone out there in the audience for joining us. Please do check up our lineup of upcoming events on our website, and we hope to see you at another one soon. And yes, please purchase the book on Powell's.
Or another book. If you have my book or you don't want to buy my book, buy a different book.
Buy her book and some other books.
Buy my book for somebody else.
All of those things. All right. Thank you so much.
And
Have a
email
great
me if you have any questions. My email's on my website. I don't mind.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.